All right, so in this video, we're going to be building a multi-user blogging platform with Next.js, Tailwind, and AWS. And we're going to be using AWS Amplify. Now, a lot of my videos often go into these one-off use cases, and I've created maybe a couple that go a little bit more in depth, but I've heard from a lot of viewers that they want to see something end-to-end. We want to add all of these different features, put them together, and build out something unique, something interesting, kind of showing how to tie everything together. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to be building everything from scratch. We're going to be building a blogging platform for people to be able to create an account, sign in, create a post, view and edit their own post, publish a post, delete a post, add cover images. We're going to be adding a lot of different AWS services along the way. So we'll be using Cognito for authentication. We'll be using S3 for image storage. We'll be using AppSync for the GraphQL API. And we'll be using DynamoDB for the database. Now, this is actually a hands-on workshop. So you're going to see linked into the comments an actual link to this workshop so you can actually copy and paste the code and code along. So this is kind of like a combination of live coding along with a workshop that you can then take and use yourself. And then as part of the workshop, there will be within the code base an actual, fully deployed version of the app that we're building. So you can kind of go and reference that if you do end up, having any issues. So this is going to be, a fairly longer tutorial video than I typically do, but hopefully by the end of it, you kind of come away with a lot of new ideas and you understand how this stack works and how all the pieces work together. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started by creating a new Next.js app. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a new Next app. And once the app is created, we're going to go ahead and change into the directory and install the dependencies that we're going to need. We're going to be using a lot of different dependencies. So we're going to be using Tailwind dependencies. We're going to be using Amplify dependencies. We're going to be having a markdown editor that we're going to be needing. So we're going to be installing some, dependencies for that as well. So I have all of these dependencies linked or listed in the docs that are accompanying this workshop. So you can just copy and paste from there, but I'm going to walk through them here as well. So we're going to be adding AWS Amplify, AWS Amplify UI React for the UI library for React. We're adding a simple markdown editor, and we're also adding a way to render markdown, and we're adding the UUID library to start off. And then next we're going to install the Tailwind dependencies separately. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and install those Tailwind dependencies I mentioned. So we're going to install the ones that Tailwind recommends, starting a new project with. So that's Tailwind at latest, post CSS, and auto prefixer. And then we're also adding Tailwind CSS typography for our markdown editor so we can add some default styling when we render markdown for things like code snippets and headings and things like that. All right, so now we need to initialize our Tailwind configuration. So I'm going to say npx tailwind init, and I'm going to say -p. And now we should see that we have this post CSS config, this Tailwind config created for us, and we're going to go ahead and open up our code editor for the first time. Try that one more time. All right, so we have our code editor, and we're going to go ahead and add a configuration to our Tailwind config, because essentially we install that typography plugin, and we want to go ahead and just kind of enable it by passing it in to the plugins array. So we want to say require Tailwind CSS / typography, and we're good to go there. The next thing we want to do is go into our globals.css file and add our Tailwind globals. So I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to kind of remove everything that's there. And I'm going to say I'm going to add Tailwind base, Tailwind components, and Tailwind utilities. This is all kind of part of the base setup when you're working with Tailwind and Next.js. And now that we're done with that setup, we want to go ahead and initialize a new Amplify project. Now, if you don't have the Amplify CLI installed, go ahead and go to the Amplify docs at docs. Let's see the actual address. So it's docs.amplify.aws, and click on Get Started. And that part of the tutorial will show you how to install and configure the CLI, or click on CLI and then install the Amplify CLI, and that will help you install the CLI. So once you've installed and configured the CLI though, you can go ahead and start creating a new project, and that's kind of what we're going to do at this next step here. So what we want to do now is go ahead and run Amplify init to initialize a new Amplify project. And this is going to walk us through all the steps that we're going to need to go ahead and get this set up. So for the name of the project, this doesn't really matter. I'll call this the default of Amplify Next. We can give an environment name. I'll take the default as well. I'm going to choose VS Code as my text editor. Our app is JavaScript, and the framework that we're using is React. Actually, it could have been Next if we had that option, but we don't. For our source directory path, because we're working with a Next project, the root is essentially the source directory. Now, this doesn't matter a whole lot, but it will start generating the files that we need by the Amplify CLI at the root of the directory when we choose this. And then for the distribution directory, we can choose .next. And we can take the defaults for the build command and the start command. And for our AWS profile, this is something you should have now that you've run Amplify configure after installing the CLI, or if you're an Amplify user, you probably already know this. And then we can choose whatever profile that we'd like to use. For me, that's going to be default. All right, so after the Amplify project has been created, you'll have this Amplify folder with your future code from the services that we create, and then we have our AWS exports file that is generated and will automatically be updated for us, and we'll be using that in just a moment to configure our project. But the first thing we might want to do is add a feature. So the first thing we might need is a way to have a user create posts, and we want to list the posts and things like that. So we might create an API with some data. So to do that, we're going to use the Amplify API category. I'm going to say Amplify add API, and we'll add a GraphQL API. So I'll choose GraphQL. For the API name, I might call this Next Blog or something like that. I will choose, for now, the API key as the default authorization type. In the future, and in a moment, we're going to be updating that to be a combination of private and public access. The private access would be meaning a user needs to be signed in, and that's a way that we can kind of identify who creates a post and things like that. But for now, we're just going to create a public API to kind of get things going, and that means we're going to use an API key to access. So for the name of the API key, this doesn't matter a whole lot, but I'll call this something like public. I'll give it an expiration of 1 year. I don't need any advanced settings. I don't have a schema yet, so we'll choose no. And then I will choose a boilerplate of just a single object with fields to kind of get us started. But we're going to be kind of changing this up anyway and creating our own schema. And then I'll choose yes to go ahead and edit the schema. So this is kind of the schema that Amplify will give us. But basically, we want to have a blogging app. So therefore, we might consider having a post type. The post might have an ID for uniquely identifying the post. We might want to have a title for the post title and then some content. Later on, though, we're going to be adding additional fields like ways to identify the user that created the post and also a way to add a cover image. But for now, let's go ahead and save that and deploy this API. So to do that, I'll go ahead and just save this file for the schema, and I'll run Amplify push. Now, the first time we run Amplify push, it's going to kind of walk us through a configuration for local code generation. Because when you're working with a GraphQL API, you typically need to have some local definitions for your GraphQL operations. Now, for us, we want to be able to kind of have all of those things generated for us. So the CLI will do that. So we'll have all of the queries, mutations, and subscriptions created for us if we would like. And if we do want that, we can just choose yes here. And I will choose JavaScript as the generation target. Now for the location, since we don't have a source directory, we might want to just have the GraphQL definitions created at the root. So instead of choosing the default of src, I'm going to go ahead and choose .graphql or ./GraphQL. And then I'm going to say /star/star/star.js. Meaning that we want to basically say, create the directories of GraphQL/queries, GraphQL/mutations and things like that. And that way we have all of that stuff created at the root directory so we can just import it from there. Do I want to generate all possible operations? Sure. And then for the maximum statement depth, I'll just choose the default. All right, so once the API has been created, we should see some output like this. And then if we look in our directory, we should see now that we have a GraphQL folder. And in the GraphQL folder, we'll see that we have queries, mutations, and subscriptions and things like that. And then also, if we open up our AWS exports file, we'll see that we have some configuration around our GraphQL endpoint and things like that. So that means our API was created successfully. So now what we might want to do is go ahead and add some data and test out our API real quick, and then we're going to query for that data on our next app. So to open up our API, we can run Amplify console API, and then this should open our GraphQL API, which is AppSync, in our AWS dashboard. So it should automatically open up for you something like this. So what we want to do now is let's go ahead and create a mutation or maybe two, and then query for those to kind of see if they come back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a post with the title of my first post with some content. And you're going to notice that we don't pass an ID. That's because the service will automatically generate an ID on the server. So I'll go ahead and create a post. Then I'll say maybe my second post. And then now we might want to go ahead and say query list posts. And then for the items, we want to kind of return like the ID, title, and content. And then we should see that we have our list of posts coming back. So our API is working. We can also go to our data sources here and open up DynamoDB and see that we have some items in our database. So now that we have that working, let's go ahead and update our next app to start querying for that data. So to do that, we're going to need to use this AWS exports file that we created earlier, or that was created for us earlier, I guess, by the CLI. And we're going to create a file called configure Amplify that we can then just import whenever we need to use that file to configure Amplify. So in the root of the project, I'm going to go ahead and create a file called configure amplify.js. And in this file, we're going to import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We're going to import the configuration from that AWS exports file. And then we're going to call amplify.configure, passing in the config. Now, to use this file, we can just go in any, to use this configuration, we can go in any file and just import it. So you could also do this within the file, but I think this is an easier way to do it if you need it in multiple areas, which you may need to in a next app. We're not going to need to in this app, but if you use API routes, you do need to. So I'm imported configure Amplify. So now we should be able to call our GraphQL API. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to index.js, and we're going to go ahead and clear all this out, and we're going to start writing some code. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and import a few things. First of all, we're going to import useState and useEffect from React. We're going to import the link component from Next.link. And this is going to allow us to create some navigation. We're going to create, later on, but we're not going to need it, I don't believe, at the moment, other than just linking to a post in the future, for an individual post. We're going to import the API category from AWS Amplify, and we're going to import the list post query from our GraphQL queries. The next thing that we're going to do is we'll go ahead and create a function, and we'll maybe say export default. And this is going to be our, our main function. And what we might want to do is go ahead and create some initial state to hold our posts. So what we're going to go ahead and do is maybe say something like const posts, set posts, is equal to useState, and then we'll pass in an empty array. So now we have a way to kind of, fetch some posts and then store them in our local state. So what we're going to next do is we'll go ahead and create a function and invoke the function in useEffect. So we're going to say, in useEffect, we want to call this function called fetch posts. Fetch posts is going to call the API.GraphQL operation. We're going to use the API import here, call it .GraphQL. The query that we're going to pass in is this list post query. And then once that data comes back in a variable called post data, we're going to set the post array using the post data.data.listPost.items, which is kind of just the array of items that we want without anything else. And then finally, in our UI, we want to just return, that array of posts that we're going to be mapping over. So let's take a look at this code. We're returning like an outer div to kind of wrap a header that just has our posts. We set some styling using Tailwind. So here we're kind of saying we want to use text 3XL, meaning we want to have some, larger text. We're going to be using semi-bold font. We want our letter spacing to be a little wider than the default. We have a margin top of 6 and a margin bottom of 2. So that's just going to be our header. And then we're going to map over the array of posts. And for every post in that array, and in our case that should be 2, we're going to be returning a link to the posts. And that's going to be at the /post/post.id. And we don't actually have that created yet. So if you click on this, it's not going to work. But in the future, in just a moment, we're going to be creating that actual file. And then for every post in the array, we're going to return like a div where we want to set some styling. Like we want to make sure that the cursor is a pointer, cursor. We're going to have a border of 1 pixel using this light gray color of 300. We have margin top of 8 and padding bottom of 4. And then for every item in the array, we're just going to return the post title along with a little bit more styling. And that's kind of it. This should show just like a title with an array of posts. And then in the future, in a second, we're going to be able to drill down and view that individual post. So to test this out, let's go back to our command line and run npm run dev. And we should now be able to go to localhost 3000 and test this out. So let's go ahead and open up localhost 3000. So looks like we have some type of error. Let's see what's going on there. Maybe I didn't save all of my files. So let me go ahead and make sure I save all 3 of these and then we refresh. There we go. So I hadn't saved one of those files. So now we see that we have my first post and my second post coming back. So that's great. That means our actual API is being called and our data is being returned, meaning, we're interacting with our backend. So that's a great start, but we still need to add a bunch of new things. So the first thing we might want to do, we want to be able to kind of have users the ability to update their own posts and identify who created a post. But before we can do that, we need to have some type of authentication to kind of authenticate a user. So to add authentication, let's go ahead and go back to the command line and run amplify add auth. And this is going to allow us to add authentication. Now you can either add username and password authentication or using social provider like Facebook or Google or a combination of the both. So it's up to you. If you want social login, you would choose either default configuration with social provider or manual configuration. If you just want to allow username and password like we're going to do in this tutorial, you can choose default. And for users, I will allow them to use their username to sign in, and I don't need any advanced settings. Now to deploy this update, I'm going to go ahead and run amplify push, and this will go ahead and deploy that authentication service. So while that's deploying, what we want to do now is we need to kind of have a new route for users to be able to sign in and to kind of authenticate and maybe show them a profile. So in our pages directory, we want to add a new file called maybe profile.js. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to create a new file in pages called profile.js. And you can either do it, of course, via the command line, or you can just go directly into your code and add this profile.js file. And this is kind of where we want to work next. So the first thing we want to do in profile is we want to go ahead and import or add our imports. So the first thing we're going to do is import the with authenticator and Amplify sign-out components from AWS Amplify UI React. The with authenticator gives us a full authentication flow wrapping any component, and then the sign-out button is essentially, Amplify sign-out is essentially just a sign-out button. We import the auth class from AWS Amplify. We're going to be using this to check what the current credentials are for the signed-in user, and then we're going to import the use state and use effect hooks like we often do from React. And then we're going to create a function called profile. And this is going to hold all of our, our UI and stuff and our logic. And then finally, for the default export, we're going to actually pass in the profile component to the with authenticator. So this will wrap this profile component with authentication. So the first thing we might want to do is go ahead and create some local state for holding the user and updating the user. So I might say const user and set user is set to null using useState. And then when the component loads, what we can basically do is call and check to see if there is a user and then set that user. So to do that, we're going to create a function called checkUser, and we're going to invoke that in the useEffect hook. CheckUser is going to call auth.currentAuthenticated_user. And if this succeeds, then we will go and call setUser passing in the user. Now, if there is no user, then this will fail and we will not be setting user, or the user will be null essentially, leaving it as is. And then in the profile component, we can say if there is no user, we don't want to return anything first of all. So we're going to say if there is no user, we'll return null. And then finally, in the actual component itself, if there is a user, we're going to return a very basic profile component where we're going to show the user's username and the user's email, as well as a way to sign out. Now, in the future, you might want to add additional functionality here, like a way to update their attributes or add additional attributes. But for now, this is kind of a good way to just kind of get something going for a basic profile component. We've added some styling here, for a heading, like we're using this text 3XL for most of our headings. We're adding a little bit of styling around the font and margin and things like that. And that's kind of about it. So we'll go ahead and save this file. Go ahead and close it. The next thing we want to do is we want to add some styling to our Amplify UI components, because by default they come as a yellow color, excuse me. But for our project, we want to be using like a blue color as our theme. So we're going to be using the blue styling that comes out of Tailwind for all of our Tailwind stuff. And for the Amplify component, we're going to go into our styles and we're just going to add a root element for the Amplify primary color, Amplify primary tint, and Amplify primary shade. And this is going to be a global override that kind of uses any of the Amplify UI components that use these colors will automatically be overridden. And we're going to be using this blue color of 2563EB. And if you want to change this to another color, that's cool. But this is going to basically change the buttons and things like that from our Amplify UI components to be this blue color. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then finally, the next thing we need to do is we need to have a way to have some navigation to be able to link to that profile component and kind of sign in and stuff. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to do that in app.js. Now, the only other import that we're going to need is link from next link, because we're going to be needing a way to link to individual posts, and we're going to be wrapping them in this link component from next link. And for our return, let's go ahead and delete this because we're going to be writing some custom code here. Now here we're going to be returning two main items. We're going to be returning our main component as well as our navigation. So let's go ahead and return that code and take a quick look at it. Okay, so basically what we have is you can kind of separate this into two areas, our nav here, and then our actual main component here, which is going to be returning, the main component from our app. The thing that we're doing that's a little different than we had by default, we're applying some global styling that's going to be applied to every single page. So we're basically saying we want a padding Y of 8 and a padding X of 16, meaning we want the top and bottom padding to be 8 REM based on our configuration with Tailwind, and we want our left and right padding to be 16. And then any component that we render, any page that we render is going to be applied to the styling. The next thing we're doing is we're adding some navigation at the top of our page. And this is going to have a list of links, and these links are going to grow throughout our app as we add additional links and things like that. But we're going to start off with a link to the home component, or the home page, which is at the root. We're going to also be adding a link to our profile that we just created at /profile. And then we're going to be having a link for /create post that will not work at the moment because we don't have this page created yet, of course. But in the future, we're going to be, in a moment, adding the ability for users to create a new post. We added some basic styling, like I mentioned, we have like a border bottom of 1 pixel, and it's like this light gray color with some padding. And we have some styling that's going on across all of our, actual nav items. So with that, we should be able to go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my command line. I'm going to say npm run dev. And we should be able to go to localhost 3000 again. And we should see that we have our list of posts still, but we should now have a new way to link to our profile. And then if we're not signed in, we should be able to sign in and create a new account as well. So we see our posts. We see that we have a little bit of styling going on now. If we go to profile, we should see this profile component. So I'm going to go ahead and click create an account. And I'll go ahead and create an account. Now I should be getting some multi-factor authentication. So I should be getting like a confirmation code or something like that to my email address. So I'll go ahead and open my email over here in a separate window. And I'll paste in my confirmation code. And then now that I'm signed in, I should have this profile page. Whoops, of course, create post isn't going to work yet. But if I go to home, I'll go to profile, I should now see my profile there. So we have that working. And now that we have a way to authenticate a user, we can actually add authorization to our API, meaning we can start authorizing, these requests based on the signed in user. Now, Amplify helps you a lot in this area, not only in actually setting up the backend infrastructure, but also making the API calls, as we're going to see in just a moment. But we need to now update our API settings by running Amplify update API to recognize additional authentication or authorization providers. So I'm going to run Amplify update API. We're going to choose GraphQL, and I want to choose here update auth settings. And I'm going to go ahead and choose the authorization type continuing to be public API key for the base authorization type. And I'll go ahead and kind of keep those same settings that I had before. But now I'm going to add an additional auth type. And I'm going to be able to choose Amazon Cognito user pools because that is what Amplify uses for its authentication provider. It's kind of a managed authentication service. So we can choose that. And now we've updated our GraphQL API to be able to use authentication. Now, what we now need to do is we need to have a new field in our GraphQL schema to be able to add who the user is that created the post. And we can go ahead and update that by going into our Amplify folder, into the backend/API, and then next blog API has this schema.graphql where we have our base type. And right now we have a type of post with an ID and a title and a content field. And we have this at model, which is kind of a directive what Amplify uses to generate CRUD and list operations, as well as GraphQL subscriptions, database, and stuff like that. But we don't have any auth going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to update our model. And we still have the ID, the title, and the content field. Now we're adding, though, a username field. And I'll kind of go ahead and make this a little larger. The username field is a way for us just to store whoever created the post, their username. This is going to be like their unique identifier. You could use any identifier that you would like. So you can use a sub, or you can use a username, or if you want to create something custom. But for our example, we're going to be using the username. We're also creating some auth rules, and we want to have multiple authentication or authorization scenarios going on. If you think of an app like Twitter, or you think of an app like Facebook, or even Instagram, if you're not signed in, you're often able to view someone else's posts if they're public. But if you are the owner of that, you might be able to set additional privileges, or you might even be able to restrict people from seeing it at all. And to do that, you need multiple types of authentication and authorization. And that's what we're doing here. We're basically saying we want to have owner privileges for the person that created the actual post. So if I created a post, I can do everything. I can read, update, delete, do whatever, right? But if I'm not the owner, I can only do a single operation, and that is read. And this is going to allow users that are not the owner of the post to only be able to query a single post and kind of read it, or query all of your posts. So it's going to kind of have this combination of public and private access. And then the last thing we're doing is we want to have an additional data access pattern. we want to be able to query these posts by the username. And I want to say, okay, I only want to get the posts that I created, because right now the only query that we have is this list post query that we've been running. This brings back to all of the posts. That means if we have 10 or 20 different users creating posts, it's going to return all of those, which is fine, for maybe a main view. But I might want to have a custom view for myself where I can only see my own posts and maybe update those. So that's what we're doing here. We want to have a custom access pattern where we're going to say we want a query called posts by username, and then we want to be able to query on the username field, passing in some type of argument. So for me, if my username is Dabbit3, I can now query for only the posts created by Dabbit3 as the username. And we'll be given a new GraphQL query called posts by username. And I'm going to go ahead and save this schema. And then now what we should be able to do is go ahead and run a new deployment. So we should be able to say amplify push --y. And this is going to go ahead and deploy the updates to the API category based on the two adjustments that we made. One from updating our schema, and then the other from actually changing the type of authorization that we're working with. So what we want to do now is we're going to create a file for page for creating posts. So I'm going to go into pages, and I'm going to have a new page called createpost.js. And this page is going to have quite a few imports. So let's go ahead and get started with our imports. We're importing the with authenticator from UI React because we want to make sure that the user is signed in before trying to create a post. Even though in a second you're going to see that we have other ways of maybe managing the nav to only allow people to maybe see a certain nav item. And we could do that as well if we'd like. We're going to be using useState from React. We're using the API category again. We're now also using the UUID library to create a unique identifier. We're using use router from Next router because we want to have programmatic routing. After they create a post, we want to kind of route them to that post. We're using the simple Markdown editor, which is a really simple, Markdown editor for allowing users to kind of create Markdown. We're using the styling for simple Markdown editor. We're importing that because we're going to need that to style the editor. And then we're importing the create post mutation from our GraphQL API. From our GraphQL operations. For this create post component, we're going to need to be keeping up with a couple of pieces of state. We want to keep up with the post title and the post content. Therefore, I'm going to create an object called initial state, and then that's going to hold that. So I'm going to create a function now called create post, and this is going to be our main React component. And then for the default export, I'm going to say I want to call the with authenticator wrapping the create post component like we did earlier. To get started, let's go ahead and create a couple of pieces of state, or a couple of local variables and things like that. So we're creating a post that is set to this initial state object with an empty title and an empty content field, and a function called setPost that allows us to kind of update that post. We're going to destructure the title and the content so we can use that in different areas within our component. And then we're going to use a reference to router by calling use router there. We're next going to have a function called onChange. And onChange is going to be for when the user types into one of the input fields, we go ahead and update the post with the event name and the event value. So if someone types into a form, we want to update the title or the content based on whatever form they're working with. And then finally, and this is going to update this, our state variable. And then finally, we want to have a function for creating a new post. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the title and the content are there, and if they're not, we're going to just return for some light form validation. We're going to create an ID, and we're going to be using this ID to kind of, set the ID of the post manually, and that way we can actually go ahead and navigate to that single individual view and view it after it's been created. We're going to then call api.graphql, passing in the query, which is create post, the variables, which is the post variable coming off of our local state, which at this point should contain an ID, a title, and a content field. And then we're setting the auth mode by overriding the default auth mode. Now, and if we go to really quickly, let's take a look at index.js, where we call api.graphql. All we're passing in is a query here. We're not passing in any auth mode because the default auth mode is API key, meaning that it's going to send a public request by default. If we want a private request or a private API call, we need to now pass in this auth mode, which is kind of us saying, hey, this is authenticated request, send along the request headers that include the identity token and things like that. And then that way, in the actual GraphQL API, we're going to read your username and then populate the username field for you. And then after this is successful, we just, again, navigate to the actual post. Now for our UI, we're going to be returning a fairly simple UI for this component, I think, where we have a header for saying create a new post along with some styling, similar to the other styling we've been using for our header. We have a form input for the title field, along with a bunch of styling here. We have an onChange handler that calls our onChange function up here. And all the stuff you would think of for a input component. Then we have our simple markdown editor, which is a really simple component, really, when you look at it. The only thing that we're setting is the value and the onChange handler. That's it. The onChange handler is going to keep up with the value as the user types, and then the value sets the current value. And then the last thing we have is a button to go ahead and create a post. So on click, we're going to call this create new post function, which calls our GraphQL API and allows the user to go ahead and create a new post. Now, to view this individual post, we need to now have a new folder to be able to work with this /post/ID that we've referenced now a couple of times, because we also referenced this in our index.js file. So to do that, we're going to be able to have a new folder called posts. And then here we're going to have essentially a dynamic route where we say id.js. And this will allow us to have a single item view for a post. So to get started, we'll go ahead and import our imports. So we have our API category from AWS Amplify. We have use router from Next router, like we've been using earlier. We import our configure Amplify, but I think that we don't even need that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. We also have list posts and get posts from GraphQL/queries. So we're going to be using both the list post query and the get post query from our GraphQL queries. That's because with Next.js, we're going to be using these different APIs like get static paths and get static props. Get static paths is going to go ahead and create paths using each individual post that's going to be retrieved from this array of list posts. And then get static props is going to create the actual props for each individual post. Therefore, we need to kind of call get post for every item in that array. So what we're expecting in this component is we're expecting to have a post variable coming in as a prop. So we're expecting that post to be right here. And then if there is a post, then we're going to be basically, there should be one, right? So if there is one, we're going to basically be rendering each individual post metadata. So we're going to have the post title, the post username, and we want to have the React Markdown with the post content. And then we're passing in an interesting class name here called pros. And this has to do with that Tailwind configuration we set up at the beginning. And this is going to allow us to kind of say we want this Markdown editor to have the styling for a Markdown editor. So meaning that we want to have some special styling for headers, some special styling for Markdown that we're going to have within this Markdown editor, like I guess code and stuff like that. So the other interesting thing going on here is we're using fallback routes. So what we want to basically do is we want to be able to build this app and have, let's say, 10 posts being built as part of the initial build. But if someone creates a new post, we want to be able to use the fallback functionality, meaning even though it wasn't part of the original build, let's go ahead and fetch that post and then update it and then render it. And to do that, we need to pass in a couple of lines of code to check if the route is a fallback route. And if it is, we don't want to return the main component. We want to return like some type of loading indicator or something like that. So how do we get this post data? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to do. First of all, we want to have a get static paths function. Get static paths is going to create each individual path or each individual page essentially for an item in some type of array typically. And we're going to get that data by calling api.graphql, getting that array of posts. This is the same API call we called in the index.js file. We're going to then create a paths array where we're going to map over the items array, and we're going to get a new array out of that array, right? We want to map over all of the items array, and we want to say for every item in the array, we need an object that looks something like this. We want to have an object that has a params property with an ID. And because we're on this id.js, the ID is going to be what we kind of use in the next function, get static props. And the prop will be passed in as params.id. So with that being said, we can now return this paths array, and we're setting fallback to true, meaning that we do want fallback mode to work. And then finally, we need to go ahead and create our get static props function. And get static props is going to have this params object that we're expecting here. So that's being created here, passed in here, and then every time, for every item in this array, get static paths is going to be called once, passing in this params object that should look something like this. So we know that we have params.id, so that's what we do here. We just destructure that off of the argument. We then call GraphQL API again for the single individual post. And with this single individual post, we can now return that as a prop back to our component, to our main component. So let's go ahead and kind of minimize that. So the post that is being passed in here is getting received here. And then we're going to basically say, for whatever data is there, it's going to be passed in here, and then we can use it in our main component. So the flow is kind of like get static paths, then get static props, and then for every item and get static props, we're basically creating a new post at the ID route of the item itself. So it's going to be something like the root of our project / post / whatever the ID is. And I guess starting off, we should have maybe like 2 posts, right? But we're going to see, because we might want to update some of our data to make sure that we have user information. So we might start off from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then the last thing we want to do is let's go ahead and update the index.js page. And the main thing that we want to do is we want to add some fields for the author. So I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, for, we have the title and we have that there. So let's now have an area for the author, because now that we have that metadata about the signed-in user, and that's going to be automatically added to every post, we want to go ahead and render out the username for that post as well. So now when this loads, once we've started creating posts with a user, the username will also render as well. Now, for this to work, actually, since we don't have any items created by a user yet, let's go ahead and delete the posts that we have in our database. So, I kind of showed you how to do this earlier, but you would run Amplify console API. You would click on data sources. You would go to DynamoDB. And then we will go ahead and just have the items section chosen and delete those posts. Okay, so that being said, what we can now do is test this out. So I'm going to go to the running app, and let's go ahead and start this again. Okay, cool. So we don't have any posts, but we should be able to click now Create Post and see that we have a way to create a new post. So I'm going to say test post number 1, and then I'm going to say like hello world. We have this nice markdown editor here, and I can say this is code. Conclusion. So we have some really basic stuff. Now, when we create this post, we should be navigated to the single item view, and we should be able to see that post. There we go. So we see that we have our post there. We see the author information, Dabbit3. We have our actual post there. And if I go to home, I should now see that I have my post, and I should be able to go ahead and click on it and view the details for that post. So we're getting somewhere. The next thing that I want to do though is I want to add a way for signed in users to be able to edit their own posts. So to get started with that, we first need to have a view for those posts to begin with. So within our main pages view, let's create a new page called My Posts. In My Post, this is going to be very similar to the main post view actually. So I'm going to just drop in, essentially the same code that we have in index.js, where we're basically just rendering an array of posts. And in just a moment, though, we're going to be actually, adding some additional fields for like editing and stuff like that. But for now, we just want to go ahead and query those posts. Now, the main difference here is in the actual fetch post function, instead of calling list posts, we're calling the post by username query. That was the that custom query that we created that we wanted to send using the current username of the user. Now this is an authenticated request, basically meaning that we need to go ahead and set some of that authentication information. So we can either do that there, or we can kind of maybe set this as an authenticated view by basically wrapping this in the with authenticator. Or what we can do in this example that we're going to kind of add in here is that we're going to make this link overall just completely protected, meaning that if you are not signed in, you're not even going to see the link. But let's say that you are not signed in and you navigate here also. This is not going to be able to work because you're going to not have a current signed in user. So the auth.current authenticated user is going to fail, and this function will never even get called in the first place. So that's kind of, so we're going to kind of go with this current setup here where we're basically calling the post by username query, and the variables that we're passing in are the username. And then once the data comes back, we call set post again, very similar to what we did in index.js. What we need to now do though is we need to have a way to update the navigation to only show the link for my post if a user is signed in. So to do that, we're going to need to do a couple of things. So what I'm going to do is we're going to open app.js, and we're going to go ahead and import use state and use effect from React. We're going to import auth and hub from AWS Amplify. We've already used auth, but hub is new. Hub is a way to kind of use an event listener for different type of events. And in this case, we're going to be listening for the auth event, meaning that if a user signs in, signs up, does any type of authenticated operation that has to do with the authentication flow, this hub is going to fire, and we're going to basically have the information based on that event. And that means we can now create like a function called, in this case, we're going to create a function called auth listener. And we're going to basically say hub.listen. And we're going to say, if there is an auth event, we want to call various functions. And these functions are basically going to be interacting with some new local state that we're going to create called signed in user. So we want to, when this component loads, we want to check and see if there is a signed in user. And if there is, we want to show and hide UI based on that. So we're going to create a signed in user variable set to false. This could also be, null, I guess. And then we're going to create a function called set signed in user that is going to update this user. And then auth listener is basically going to be listening to that auth event, and basically it's going to say if the user is signed in, then we want to set that the signed in user is true, and if there is not a signed in user, we want to set it to false. So for the initial call of this, it's going to happen in use effect. And what we might want to do is when the app initially loads, we want to also check if there is a currently signed in user when the app loads. And if there is, we also want this to happen. So we don't only want it to happen during the auth event, we want it to happen on the app load. So therefore, when we call this function, maybe we'll go ahead and pass in the empty array here, is that we also are calling auth.current authenticated user. And this is basically going to fire when this component loads. If there is a signed in user, then we're going ahead and updating that as well. So this will invoke when the component loads, and then it will start listening to events that happen in the future. So now that we have this signed in user variable that's going to be toggled true or false based on whether or not there is a signed in user, we can now go to our navigation and maybe say that we want some logic that looks something like this. We want to say if there is a signed in user, only in that case do we want to render this this navigation item for my posts. And we should be able to go ahead and save that, and we should be able to go ahead and test this out. So to test it out, we'll go back to our app, and you see that we have this new My Posts. And this is only going to list the posts for the signed in user. So let's test that out, right? So how can we test that out? I'm going to go to create a post. I'm going to say post number 2. And really something basic because I don't really care about the content. I'm really here to test out the functionality. So we have 2 posts now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go into DynamoDB, and I'm going to find the username field, and I'm going to change this to Jennifer. And then I'm going to go back to my posts, and I'm going to refresh. And now I see I only have 1 post, but if I go to home, I see that I have 2 posts, one by me and one by someone else. So we know that actual query is only fetching our own data. But we also might want to see, like, what happens if we sign out? We want this to not work. So if we sign out, we see that link went away completely. And if we go to my posts as a non-signed in user, which shouldn't happen anyway, but nothing shows up because we're not signed in, meaning that we have to have an authenticated user for this to work. So I'm going to go back to profile. Let's go ahead and sign back in. We still have more work to do. We need to give users a way to edit their own posts and also delete their own posts. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to edit post. And we're going to start, importing some stuff and making some changes. Oh, you know what? We don't even have this created yet. So what we're going to need to do now is, so like right now, if we view a single post, we're going to /post/ something. But what we might want to do is, there's 2 ways we can handle this. We could have like some type of way to say, okay, if the user is signed in, we want to like render a different UI here. But I think what makes even more sense is to have like an edit post, actual, page where we can say, okay, if they're at this page, then we want to allow them to edit, and of course only if they're editing their own. And therefore, we're going to create another, folder in our pages directory, and we're going to call this edit post. And in edit post, we're going to create another like id.js. Now, edit post is going to be very similar to create post. The main difference is we're going to also have a way for people to, I guess, it's going to be very similar, actually. I'm trying to think of what the main differences are. Not really a whole lot of differences. I think the main difference is going to be in the way that we actually fetch the initial post. So what we want to basically do is go ahead and, first of all, get our imports going. So we have use effect and use state. We have our API category from AWS Amplify. The same stuff we've been using, use router, simple markdown editor. We have our get post query as well as our update post query. So actually, now that I think about it, one of the main differences here is that for each individual time that the component loads, we're going to be fetching the single post versus in the actual static view, we're viewing like a statically generated page. So this is going to be more dynamic, and actually that makes a lot more sense, right? Because you shouldn't be able to edit something that is static. So, and then you're going to maybe wonder, okay, so if we do a static build, and then we're allowing users to edit, how do we kind of make it to where that they see an updated version? Well, we're going to be using the revalidate functionality from Next.js to kind of to get around that, I guess you'd say. Meaning that after X number of minutes or whatever, we want to go ahead and fetch a new version of the page. But anyway, so for edit post, one of the things that we're going to need to do is when the component loads, we want to go ahead and fetch the initial post based on the route ID. So to get started though, let's go ahead and create a function called edit post. This is going to be our main component. And we want to go ahead and create some initial variables and state and stuff like that. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and create a post variable and a set post function set to null using useState. We're going to get a reference to the router, and then we're going to get a reference to the route ID, meaning like /edit post /ID. We're going to be able to get that by using router.query and getting the ID. And then we're going to use that ID to fetch the individual post. So in the useEffect hook, we're going to create a function called fetchPost, and we're going to invoke it as well. And we're going to say, okay, if there is no ID, we don't want to do anything. And then we want to say api.graphql. We're going to query the post by passing in the post ID, and then we're going to set the individual post using that data that comes back from the GraphQL API. Next, we want to basically say, if there is no post when the component loads, we'll just return null. Whoops. The next thing we want to do is we want to have that onChange handler. So we want to be able to, just like we did in create post, have just a handler for updating form fields. So onChange is going to set the event.target.name and the event.target.value like we did before. But what's going to be updated there is going to be the actual post. Because when we start off, we don't have a post. But now that we do have a post, we should be having an object that has like the post ID, the post title, and the post name and things like that. And since we have that stuff, we can go ahead and destructure it and start using it. So we know we have a post, and we're going to be needing to use the title and the content. And we're going to be using that in a couple of ways. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to have this update current post function, and this is what's going to call our GraphQL API. And we're going to say if there is no title and if there is no content, then return. And then if there is, meaning that there is some values there, we're going to allow the user to call api.graphql with update post, passing in the title, the content, and of course the ID. And once that the mutation or the update is successful, then we're just going to reroute them to view all of their posts. Similarly to when they created a post, we kind of rerouted them to view that individual post. And then the UI here is actually almost exactly like the UI in creating a post. We're going to give them a title or a heading field, I guess, for edit posts. We're going to have the input for the post title, and we're going to have a markdown editor for the post content, and then we're going to have a button that invokes the update current post function. So the next thing we want to do now is, since we have a way to actually edit the post, we need a way to give someone the ability to navigate to edit their own post. And since we only want people editing their own posts, it makes sense to maybe put this functionality in the my post component. So to do that, to start off, we're going to go ahead and import a couple of mutations. So first of all, we want to import, actually we only need one mutation, because the edit post mutation is going to be happening on the edit post component, or the edit post route. So the only thing we really need to do now is to allow the user to delete the post. So we're going to import the functionality, or the GraphQL query mutation for deleting a post. The next thing we want to do is we want to update our UI. So I'm going to go ahead and grab some updated UI. That's going to be a little bit more verbose than this. So what we're going to do is we're going to return the same heading that we've been returning, my posts. But the main difference here is that we're going to have a link for editing a post, as well as the link for viewing the post, as opposed to just clicking on the actual link itself for the entire post metadata like we were doing before. We were kind of having the post and the title, description, and all that stuff, or the author linkable. Now we're just kind of having individual buttons. So we're going to say, to edit the post, we're going to navigate you to edit post /post ID. And to view the post, we're going to navigate you to post/post ID. And then we have a button for deleting the post. Now, other than that, it's pretty much the same thing we had going on before. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to enable incremental static generation, meaning that we want to be able to kind of update the existing page for a post after a certain amount of time. Because we're allowing users to edit, we might want to like rehydrate essentially. So what we can do now is in our /post/ID, we can now go to get static props. And in addition to returning the props here, we want to set a revalidate to like some number. And this number is going to basically be the number of seconds that you would like to set the revalidation to happen. So like 100 would be like every minute and a half or something. 60 would be every minute. Whatever you would like to do. So let's say like 60 is the number we want to go with. This kind of would allow the site to be rebuilt for pages every X number of seconds. So we should be able to go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to go ahead and let's make sure. Yeah, we still have our. We still have our app being running locally. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh. And I'm going to go to my posts. And we now see that we have a way to view, edit, and delete posts. So I'm going to click View Post to test that out. I'm going to go ahead and create a new post. And then for editing a post, let's see how that works. We should see now that we have our content field pre-populated. So the edit post functionality seems to be working. So let's go ahead and say new edited title. And then we see that we have new edited title. And if we edit that again, then we have all of that still working. So we have all of that going on. So the next thing we might want to do is let's look at how to add images. So we want to be able to add a cover image. And to do that, we're going to need to work with Amazon S3. So to do that, we're going to add storage by running Amplify add storage. And this is going to allow us to kind of finalize our app by allowing users to update like a cover image for their post, similar to a lot of the sites that you see out there for doing stuff like this with Medium and Dev.to and stuff like that. So for the type of storage, we're going to say content. For the name of the service, I guess you would say, for our local project configuration, I might call this something like project images. I'm going to keep this bucket name because this doesn't really matter to me, but it does need to be globally unique, meaning no one else can have this. So I'm just going to keep that. I'm going to choose auth and guest users for access, meaning that I want people that are signed in or not signed in to be able to read these images. For signed in users, I'm going to give them full access, create, update, read, and delete. And then for guest users, I'm only going to give them access to read. Do I want to add a Lambda trigger for this bucket? I'll go ahead and say yes. Actually, no, I don't need a Lambda trigger, so I'll choose no. And then we're kind of done as far as setting up that part. The next thing we want to do, though, is we want to set up a way to have that image metadata associated with the post. So therefore, we need to add a new field into our GraphQL schema. And to do that, I'm going to go to Amplify/backend/API and back into our GraphQL schema here. And the field that we're just going to use is called cover image. And cover image is just going to allow us to associate some image in S3 with this post. And then once we have that available, we can then kind of fetch it and render it. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And we should be able to go ahead and deploy these updates. So to deploy, I'm going to run amplify push --y, and we'll go ahead and get this deployed. While that's deploying, let's go ahead and create the UI for allowing users to add a cover image. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and open create post, and we're going to start adding a few additional imports. The first thing we're going to need to do is import useRef from React. And useRef is going to allow us to kind of have a reference to another element within the DOM and be able to basically make a call to click on a hidden input that we're going to be using, so we can kind of use a nice styled button for working with our UI and stuff. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to import the storage category from AWS Amplify. The storage category is going to be how we interact with S3. So we have our imports. The next thing we want to do is we want to create some local state for working with the image, and we want to create a reference to the input that we're going to be working with and using useRef. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a variable called image and a function called setImage using useState. And then we're going to create a variable called hidden file input that is a reference to the file input that we're going to be using in just a moment. The next thing we want to do is we want to have a function called handle change and a function called upload image. Let's go ahead and save these here. So to upload an image, we want to basically have the hidden file input that we're going to be referencing in just a moment clicked by clicking on a different button. So when we click on a button that we're going to create with Tailwind, it's going to invoke this upload image function, which is going to then click on the hidden file input that we're going to basically be using for the input, but we want to make it look good, so we're styling it and we're going this route. And then handle change is basically going to be what we attach to the input. And this is going to basically say we want the event.target.files, the first item in that array, which is typically the file that you want to upload. And if there is no file uploaded, we just return. And if there is, we call setImage, passing in this file that we want to upload. And then once we have the image, we need to now make some updates to our create post function, because we need to make sure that if there is an image associated, we attach that image to the post. And we also want to upload the image to S3 because we haven't uploaded at this point. We've only saved it locally. So right under post ID, we want to say, okay, if there is an image, meaning if an image has been uploaded, we want to go ahead and create a new file name that is going to be unique. Because when the user uploads an image, it's going to have some file name, but it might be something basic. And we want to make sure that everything in our S3 bucket is unique. So to do that, we're going to say const file name is equal to the image name with an underscore unique identifier. And this gives us like a really unique image name. And then we set the post cover image as the file name, and then we upload the image to S3. So we're basically saying, okay, if there is an image, let's give it a new file name. We're going to associate the cover image with the post, and we're going to upload that. And then that's about it. Everything else should continue working. The only thing we now need to do is go ahead and create the button for uploading the image. So I would say right before we create our button for creating the post, let's go ahead and add a couple of lines of code. So we're going to first create the actual hidden file input. And we're giving this that ref of hidden file input that we created earlier in our React component. We're giving it a class name of absolute with a height 0 and a width of 0, meaning that we just want to completely hide this thing. And instead what we're going to be rendering is this button. And the button is going to call upload image, which is going to invoke the onChange handler of input, which is going to allow user to upload an image. So with that being said, we should be able to go ahead and maybe test this out. So let's go ahead and save this and see if we're allowed to upload an image or if we've broken anything. So I'm going to go ahead and go to create post. Oops, let me go ahead and restart the server. All right, so we see we have this new button that says upload cover image. So I'm going to say post with image. Oh, you know what? One thing we have not added actually is we haven't added the preview, because if we do want the image to show up as we're testing it out, we might want to add an image preview. So let's go back and do that before we continue here. And underneath the, I guess, input for the title, let's do something like this, where we basically say, okay, if there is an image, we want to go ahead and return, an image component with the image source. And we're basically saying URL.create object URL passing in the image, which is kind of the way that you would want to render the image in your UI. So save that, update this one more time, and try or refresh one more time. So we should be able to click upload cover image, and we'll click an image like this. And now we see the image, and let's go ahead and click create post. And it looks like it's working, but we're not seeing the image in our actual view. So the last thing we want to do is we want to actually render the post in the item view. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and go to pages/posts/id.js. And we might go ahead and create some local state. And to do that, let's go ahead and import useState and useEffect from React. And in the loading of the component, we're going to call useState using null, passing in null for setting a cover image variable and a set cover image function. And what we want to do is have a function that is invoked, in useEffect. And basically what we want to do is we want to say, if there is a post cover image, we want to get it and set it. And if there's not, we don't really do anything. So if there is a cover image, we're going to get the actual image URL that's going to be available for us to render an actual image from S3, calling storage.get, passing in the post cover image. And this will give us like a temporarily signed URL that we can use in our app. Because you can't just publicly grab an image from S3. There's some security rules around that. So we'll get the image key and we'll call set cover image, and that will turn this from null into something, meaning we can now maybe toggle within our UI if there is a cover image, and if there is, we want to maybe show it. So what we can now say is if there is a cover image, we want to also render that in our UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to below post title, and I might say, okay, if there's a cover image, let's go ahead and show this cover image with some really basic styling. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and refresh, and it looks like storage needs to be imported as well. So I might not be importing storage. So let's go ahead and import storage from AWS Amplify. And it looks like it's working, so I'm refreshing though. So so we see that we have our post image there. So if I go now to all of the posts and I click on post with image, I see the image. And if I go to a post without an image, I don't see an image. So we've gotten quite far. The next things that I would say that we might want to do is we want to give users the ability to update a cover image. And we also might want to render the image thumbnail here in this list view. Now, I have included both of those things in the workshop, and all you have to do is follow the next couple of steps, and you'll be able to do that. But you might want to try to do this on your own if you want to kind of ingrain this knowledge a little bit better into your head. Like, look through the code that we've written and say, okay, how would I implement this? Maybe try implementing it yourself. And if you have any trouble, you can then go back and look at the example. Now, finally, we want to actually deploy this to AWS. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that, but right now, I would typically recommend the Amplify hosting, Amplify hosting service. But we're currently working on SSR support, which should be released, within a couple of months of this video. But right now, if you deploy to Amplify, you can only deploy a static site. So what we're going to be using in this example for now is the serverless framework, and it's pretty simple to actually deploy using the serverless framework. What I basically want to do is I want to create a file called serverless.yaml and the root of the project. And I can go ahead and open up this serverless.yaml file. And I want to paste in some basic configuration for a deployment to AWS using something called the Serverless Next.js component. And here, all you have to do is just add these 2 lines of configuration. We give the app name and we give the component that we'd like to use. And this is essentially kind of like a higher level abstraction within the serverless framework. We're saying we want to use the Serverless Next serverless component, and we're using the version of 18.0. And then we just save this file and we can deploy. And if you even want to add like a custom domain, you can do that as well. And I would recommend checking out the documentation. It's pretty simple to do that. In fact, I'm going to create a video on how to do that. But to deploy to AWS, now we can just say npx serverless. And this will take a few seconds, and then it should be deployed, and we should be able to test it out. All right, once everything's been deployed, we should be given a domain for us to check it out. So an app URL. So I'll go ahead and copy that to my clipboard, and we'll go ahead and load it up. Whoops. I copied the wrong thing, I guess. Let's try that again. All right, so and once you start using the site, you should notice that it's actually noticeably faster once it's been deployed. That's because a build has been run. You could also have run npm run build and npm start and notice that it's pretty fast. So everything seems to be working. Our post with image is working. Should be able to go ahead and sign in using the same credentials as before. And everything seems to be working properly on our live domain. So that's it. That was a fairly more long video than usual for me, but I hope you learned a lot. I did have a couple of stumbling blocks along the way, but I hope that you still enjoyed everything, and I hope that you kind of learned something and take this and maybe build some interesting stuff. So if you like this video, and if you like any of my videos, please subscribe to my channel and maybe share it with people that you know. If you have any ideas around future videos, leave a comment and let me know. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you for watching this, and we'll see you next time.